Oh, well, thank you. Thank you so much, David, for inviting me to join this community this morning. This has really been a pleasure to get um, to know you guys. I am located and do my work in the traditional homelands of the Rumsen Ohlone and Esalen people. And I remember having learned a long time ago that the Esalen are extinct, and they're not. They're still here and around, and so that's where I am. When David asked me to talk for about 20 minutes about my work, and I mean, the topic is so huge, I'm like, I don't even know where to start. So we'll talk a little bit and then see where we get. I've been an educator since 1972. I was a high school teacher, originally certified as a secondary social studies teacher, and then became a learning disabilities teacher because that's where the jobs were. And then a teacher educator after that for a long time. And my work is focused on multicultural education and anti-racist multicultural education and ethnic studies. And I really believe strongly in education and the power of education there's a whole bunch of reasons. But from the work that I've been doing, I see education as very important in enabling us to learn to hear where other people are coming from and to be a world that's bigger than our own individual experience, our own individual way of interpreting the world and thinking about the world. And for a multicultural democracy, I think that that's essential. So I've been like working with education, fighting for education, advocating for education for a long time. And I know that right now we're in the midst of conflicts over education. And I'll say a little bit about that in a little bit, but I think it's partly because education has so much power. It has the power to change people, how we think, how we feel, and it also has the power to change society because as people become um, activists working towards things, we do make changes. And I think a lot of people get scared because education can change things. But let me tell you just a little bit about me and how I got into all of this. Um, I grew up in Medford, Oregon. I'm white. And from my growing up background, I'm not somebody who you would think would become an activist in anti-racism. What changed me was when I signed up for a teacher education program that was designed to prepare teachers to teach in urban schools. I graduated from college and was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life and kind of came across an advertisement for this program that I thought sounded like it would be really interesting. So I signed up and went on it. And it was based in inner city Seattle. Um, this was in 1971, and Seattle Public Schools was in the process of undergoing court-ordered desegregation. Actually, they weren't under a court order, but they were in a desegregation process and doing a lot of work around desegregation. As a part of the program, I got assigned to teach and student teach in an urban high school. When I got there, I realized that I was a well-educated person, but totally unprepared for where I was. The students were very diverse. The issues that were going on in desegregation in Seattle were things that I had no background to understand. And I started realizing how white my own education had been. So my response to it was I needed to learn. So one of the things I did was spend time just listening to the students, getting to know the students. I spent a lot of time hanging out with them, asking them questions, and then just listening to them talk about their lives. I also started reading ethnic studies literature, Black studies, Chicano studies, Native American studies, Asian American studies, and I never stopped doing that. But initially it was because I felt, even though I was well educated, I felt very uneducated for where I was and realized how limited my own education had been. And at first when I would read things like uh, Richard Wright's work, I didn't have just the background to hang anything on, but the more I read, the more things started kind of, developing this knowledge base. In addition, Seattle Public Schools, it was undergoing desegregation. And so there was a federally funded project for preparing teachers to teach in desegregated contexts. And I went through their workshops. and got to know some of the people who were a part of this project. One of the things that really struck me was I remember being in a workshop that was led by a multiracial group of people, and the person in charge of the workshop was African American. There were two white people who were part of the group. And for me, that was really eye-opening because I'd never seen white people working as a part of a multiracial coalition. And two, I hadn't seen white people following, but not being the ones in charge. And this is the early 70s, but for me, this was like, wow. And so that became like, okay, this is a different vision that I can try to work towards. While I was in Seattle, I also became friends with a number of African American educators as well as educators, other people. And in that context, started getting kind of a re-education from the perspective of people I was hanging out with. I remember, for example, people coming home from work, African American friends talking about how race, was a part of their day. And I remember thinking, wow, white people don't talk about racism. And here it's an everyday topic of conversation. And that was another one of those sort of eye-opening things for me. So when I decided to go on and get a PhD, I was trying to figure out, first I thought I was going to go into special education because as a learning disabilities teacher, I was in special ed. But I decided what I really wanted to do was work on multicultural education, which was just coming into visibility as a field. So I contacted Dr. Carl Grant at the University of Wisconsin to see if there was a place for white people in this work. And he said, yeah, come on, and you can work with me. And so that's kind of how I got into doing what I've been doing. But for about the next 30 years, I have worked with teachers a lot, people going into teaching, people who are currently teachers in a graduate program or doing workshops or designing professional development for teachers. And the main part of my work has been trying to help people envision schools and particularly classrooms as spaces that are organized in ways that are not Eurocentric, so that the curriculum represents diverse perspectives, diverse points of view, diverse experiences, so that people can learn to talk with each other and hear each other across their differences, and also places where students who have historically been undertaught are challenged intellectually, so that everybody is challenged intellectually, everybody grows intellectually. And for me, this has been like super, super interesting work, not only teaching about this, but also trying to learn how to live this kind of teaching in my own life. I'm retired now, although you don't necessarily know that by looking at the stuff that I keep doing. I've sort of like, sometimes I joke that I kind of flunked retirement. I've become an advocate for ethnic studies, and I continue to do that, which came about in about 10 years ago, when the National Education Association, the teachers union, contacted me and asked if I would review the research of the impact of ethnic studies on students. So I did, and have since then written an update of the findings. And there's a report that's on the NEA website, but overall what I found, and this has been actually very useful, is that when you look at all the research that's been done on the impact of an ethnic studies curriculum, ethnic studies teaching on students of color, the impact is almost uniformly positive. Students do better in school, graduate at higher rates, their GPAs go up. Every academic measure that you can think of, students do better when they have access to ethnic studies. White students also benefit from ethnic studies, and the research also shows this, especially when it's designed partly around real, genuine questions that students have about race and racism. And when it's interactive, and when students can see themselves, see what they can do, working in coalitions with other people to address racism. So this is kind of some of the work that I've been doing most recently, is looking at ethnic studies and kind of getting that information out to people. Sometimes I'll talk to school boards or whoever wants me to come in and talk about what the research says. David asked me what I see in this particular moment. And one of the things that this won't come as a surprise to any of you, but that I see is this profound fear in the shift in our nation's demographics as we're becoming a majority people of color. And a lot of white people are just plain scared. And I think that a lot of the backlash we have against schooling comes out of that fear about what it means, who we are as a nation. How do you share power in a place in which white people are just take for granted dominating? And these fears play out in education in specific ways. One way is in the debates people have about whether education, usually the debates aren't framed this way, but it boils down to this: is education a private good or a public resource? And it can be both, but I really see education as a public resource that's really fundamental to a multicultural democracy, that everybody should have access to a high quality education, and one that enables us to be able to work across our differences. A lot of people don't see education that way. And so it shows up, for instance, in not fully funding education very well. So some communities have access to a very well-funded education and other communities don't. And I think that's the problem. But the other way that these fears are playing out is in the sort of critical race theory culture wars. And about 2 years ago, when, is it 2 years ago, 3 years ago? Anyway, when these culture wars got initiated in 2010, I remember hearing that Donald Trump was banning critical race theory. And I laughed because I thought, I mean, I think he says a lot of stupid things, and this is one more stupid thing. And I was like, you don't ban a theory. And I've used critical race theory in my own work. So it's to some extent, the attack felt a little bit personal in addition to sounding stupid. For those of you who don't have a background in critical race theory, just briefly, it comes out of legal studies. And it asks the question, essentially, of in the post-civil rights era, where laws mandating racism have been, for the most part, eliminating from the books, but racism still continues to exist in everyday life. How does race work? How is it so built into the fabric of our system that you can have what seem like race-neutral laws, and yet you still have racism? And so looking, for instance, taking the idea that we built this nation on taking land from the indigenous peoples and essentially committing genocide, and on enslaving peoples of African descent. And those were fundamental, and the rest of our institutions have gotten built on that basis. So how does race work? And so in legal studies and in graduate studies and education and other disciplines, uh, critical race theory offers some analytical tools for looking at those questions. So when I heard Donald Trump say that he was banning critical race theory, I'm like, he doesn't even know what critical race theory is. But what I then came to realize is that the term itself had been taken by somebody named Christopher Rufo, who then worked with Trump and blah, 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 and weaponized, because the right had been looking for, and particularly some of the, well, Rufo was one of them, looking for a way of galvanizing people on the right and trying to break up the multiracial coalition that had voted for Obama and peel white people off, and so that they would vote conservative. And they take the terms critical, race, and theory and string them together, and you can turn that into something scary. And it's had a sort of a twofold purpose. One has been to silence perspectives that the white right finds uncomfortable, like Black narratives having to do with how systemic racism works. So you get a lot of books banned in schools, and you get the controversy around African-American, the African-American college board. The LGBTQ and trans perspectives get sort of banned or silenced because they disrupt the notions, the rights notion of the patriarchal family structure. Perspectives of colonized peoples, including Palestinians, get banned because that disrupts the whole idea of settler colonialism. And the idea of focusing on schools has been that you can activate adults if they think something nefarious is happening to their kids. So you tell them that their kids are being brainwashed in schools and they need to get politically active and show up at school board meetings. And then you can kind of get this stuff going that we've seen going. So getting parents enraged and activated, in addition to silencing perspectives that the right finds uncomfortable, is I think what all of this is about. These kinds of controversies aren't new. Sometimes people think that we're in the middle of something that hasn't really happened before, but there's a long history of trying to silence perspectives of people of color from education. Certainly, the outlawing Black literacy during slavery was one of those, but there have been prior attacks on curriculum in the 1990s, and some of you look, many of you look probably old enough to maybe remember in the 1990s, where there were attacks against ethnic studies, Black studies, Afrocentrism, and multicultural education. We didn't have social media, didn't have the internet, so the attacks didn't take place that way. It was mostly in books and magazine articles. After World War II, there were also attempts to silence anti-racist curriculum, because right after World War II, there was for about 2 years a kind of a coming together of African-American teachers who had been teaching about racism, sometimes, covertly, coming together with white teachers who were looking at what the Nazis had done and saying, never again. We need to raise people's awareness about racism. And so there was quite a bit going on in the public schools that then got smashed under the McCarthy. So this isn't new. It's and it'll happen again, but it's still I think a dangerous moment. And I know that we're in California, and I'm glad that we're not in Florida or Texas, where the bans have been much more well legislated than they are in California. But in California, I know that much of this stuff is also happening. A friend of mine who's a university faculty member used to be at another university in Southern California. She had been very outspoken about immigrant rights. And eventually, she told me about these like busloads of traveling harassers that will go from school district to school district and city to city, and then pretend like they're local folks, but they're not. Then they get in their bus and go someplace else to harass people. But so they were coming and harassing her, and in addition to some of the people who lived in her community. And once the harassers started coming after her kids, which is what happened for her, that was the tipping point. And so she left California and is now in Austin, Texas. And I saw her recently and said, didn't you go from the frying pan into the fire, going from California to Texas? And she said, well, in Austin, people are taking care of me. So this stuff tends to be all over. What for me kind of heartens me and keeps me going is looking at the work of activist teachers right now. California has a state requirement that students graduate from high school, public high schools, with a class in ethnic studies. Now, ethnic studies can be a way of reworking the whole curriculum, but at least we have a requirement that's kicking in this next year that students graduate from high school having taken a course in ethnic studies. And the CSU system also has a requirement. And a lot of that has come about through grassroots work in California, starting mainly in communities of color, and a lot of it with students who have been advocating for an education that they can relate to. I could, give examples and talk about what I see teachers doing, because some of it's pretty exciting stuff. But I guess I see hope in our future when kids are empowered intellectually and culturally, who can learn how to take the reins of making positive changes for a diverse population. And when I see what young people are capable of doing, then sometimes, I look at the adults and I'll shake my head, and I'll look at the young people and I'll say, well, there's hope for the future. And so I'll just kind of stop, but I've been sponsoring some of the ethnic studies work at CSUMB because I believe that this is important stuff. So I'd be real happy to open up to conversation or questions or anything that you would like to talk about.
Margie, did you want to start or do you want me to?
You go ahead, Anarosa.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I didn't get a taste of ethnic studies until I got to college at UC Santa Barbara, and it completely changed my life. I don't think I would be the same person as I am today if I hadn't majored in Chicano studies. And I feel like it's strategic that most folks don't get this education unless they get to a higher education, because what a different life people would have if this started from pre-K, right? Like literally preschool. Is there a movement to start that young? I know there's a movement for high school because that's been here in Santa Barbara, but how about even younger?
Yeah, there is. I think as far as I know, Oakland may be the place that has the best developed, longest kind of long history of developing ethnic studies from transitional kindergarten all the way through. And I've seen an outline of what their kindergarten through 8th grade curriculum looks like. And it's like, wow, yeah, it sort of starts with self and community and works out into larger issues and kids learning to become activists around community issues. It's very exciting stuff. People are beginning to produce books about ethnic studies at the elementary level. A friend of mine at CSU Fullerton is just in the process of, she'll be coming out with a book. She taught 5th grade and was doing a lot with ethnic studies. Now she's a teacher educator, and now she's writing about what she's doing, but they also have as a part of their elementary program at Fullerton and sort of an ethnic studies strand for learning to do ethnic studies at the elementary level. So it's coming.
Yay! I saw Michael's hand.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Christine, I hope first of all, at some point, can you put your email address into our chat before everything's over? But I just wanted to personally thank David and thank him for asking you here and you for your presentation. My whole neurological pathways are on fire right now from listening to you. Oh gosh, this has just been, I feel like I've been to an intellectual, socio-emotional Disneyland listening to you and all the stuff that you said. I love what your CRT explanation, it was so functional for us. We've all been banging our heads over this, but I just wanted to tell you, most people don't realize, but ethnic studies, at least in California, has a pretty rich history. From 1973 to 1980, I taught high school juniors and seniors Chicano studies, Black studies, sociology for that period, and it was wonderful. And I just wanted to share with you, and maybe I can get you a copy, but my master's thesis in 1974 was on the status of Mexican American studies, Chicano studies, in 10 selected school districts in California. So, man, I'm just bubbling from it, and I'm hoping that you can come back and talk to us again. So thank you.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to meet you. Yeah, we can have some conversations. Yeah.
And then I also see Bonnie's hand.
Hi. I was wondering, in your studies, wherever you're at, are there any people with visible physical disabilities around? There's millions of people that don't have obvious disabilities, but also, how is that area covered?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because much of my, especially my earlier work in multicultural education, since I came from out of special education, I was
Mhm.
connecting disability with race, ethnicity, gender,
Okay.
social class.
Right.
And that usually doesn't happen.
Mhm.
I was just a couple of days ago talking with somebody who's doing research in the San Francisco Unified on the ethnic studies program that San Francisco Unified has. And they've been doing a really good job with it for about 15 years or so now. And they have done a little bit of, but not much, connecting disability issues with race and class and gender. And we were talking about that there needs to be more of that. There's a area of work now called DisCrit, which is critical disability studies in education, which connects critical race theory with critical disability. And it's interesting stuff because it's looking at the intersections there, but not a lot of people are doing it. And it hasn't really made its way into ethnic studies at the K-12 level. I think right now people are just kind of working with trying to get ethnic studies at K-12 level even right as far as race and ethnicity goes. But I think that's a really important question because there's potential there that needs to get worked with more than it is.
Now, I have one more question, sweetie. When you're special ed training and whatnot, in your experience, did you try to include all disabilities with that? Because not all people with disabilities have developmental disabilities and vice versa and all that. So I was wondering how is that affecting you? How do you work with that?
Yeah, yeah, I've okay, this is a complicated question. Um, I was a learning disabilities teacher, and initially in the like teaching the exceptional child classes that I took and then have taught a couple of times, they would have like about 9 different disabilities. Learning disabilities, mental retardation, physical disabilities, blindness, deafness, speech pathology, and I sort of forget what all of them were, but I kind of from the beginning started differentiating between disabilities that are manifest in school, but not other places. And like learning disabilities is one of those. It sort of becomes an artifact of schooling, but and out of school, people do things, just sort of normal part of the community. And disabilities that are visible and present both in school as well as out of school, like deafness, blindness, physical disabilities. Because the school, and in some ways the school created disabilities. And I started thinking about this when I was a high school learning disabilities teacher. And I was both helping to construct who got into the programs and what it meant to be disabled based on what other teachers would say and who they would say you need to test this person for. So I almost lost track of the question, but it's complicated. Another area with disabilities that there's been, I think maybe a little bit more work and conversation has been around deafness as a language, and with then deafness connected with second language acquisition around language issues. So if you can frame it as a disability or frame it as a language issue, and I see it framed both ways.
Thank you. I see David's hand.
You
Oh, okay. Is that better? Thank you very much for your presentation. I must say, I'm utterly in awe and congratulate you on your spectacular career. And it must have taken a tremendous amount of courage. I guess my question is this. Um,
Oh,
You're mute again.
Oh, sorry about,
No, you're on mute again.
okay. I'm so sorry. My question is, do you think that ultimately the answer lies in demographics, and that the minorities who will become majorities will ultimately rule? Is that what's happening? I mean, I do see a lot of what's going on in our society as a reaction, a sort of, hopefully, a last gasp. But do you think that ultimately what's going to happen is that as minorities increase in numbers, and us white folk decrease and become a smaller minority, that our influence will wane?
Well, the influence of white people will wane because white people, I think, have had a disproportionate influence. What I would like to see is collaborative power sharing. That's a hard thing to learn how to do. But I sort of go back to, this is just for me, the model I saw of professional development when I was a classroom teacher. That was a multiracial group that had white people in it, but it wasn't presumed that white people were in charge.
Right.
And if we can learn to do that, I think we'll be okay.
Thank you.
But it takes learning to both power share as well as resource share, because white people have also hogged the resources. And we still do.
Barbara and then Matthew.
Hi, thank you, Christine, for coming. I don't know if maybe I can even email you later, but I'm an assistant principal at a local high school, trying to implement ethnic studies for the first time like this upcoming year. And I'm finding just the challenges, it comes down also to, which we haven't touched on, just the recruitment. I mean, I live in a very white world as an administrator. Our teachers are mostly white. And to me, it's so key who is teaching this, and the class and trying scheduling, graduation requirements, all of it. So I don't know if you have any resources that you could share with me, just in terms of teacher training, or maybe what other high schools are doing.
Oh, different high schools are doing so many different kinds of things. What part of the state are you in?
I'm in, it's in Lompoc, California. It's a little town of about 40,000, about an hour north of Santa Barbara.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Well, for teacher training, one of the things that I think is really important is that teachers have some content background in ethnic studies. And I know it sounds both simple and difficult to say, get teachers to read, but there's a lot of just knowing Chicano history, knowing African-American history. It's hard to do ethnic studies at all well without some background in history and some background in content knowledge. So
Exactly, right.
and your part about who the teacher is also really important, because the ability of the teacher to make connections with the kids, regardless of whether it's white kids or kids of color, but to connect with kids, because you're going to be getting into sensitive issues, is that's also like critically important. But for teacher training and what's available, let's see, what would be available in the area of Lompoc. I know where Lompoc is. Let's see, you're not too far from, I don't know if CSU's Cal Poly, San Luis.
We're close to you. We're closer to UCSB, but I can also email you later. And
Yeah.
but it's just, again, it's like, this is a bigger, broader issue, obviously, but in terms of who's teaching it, like you said, is just key. If they're not comfortable, if they don't want to teach it, if they,
Yeah, and the
background.
state has been saying that people with a social studies credential can teach ethnic studies, but that's not true, because you can have a social studies credential and not have the background, or
Right,
have the ability to connect with kids and
right. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Matt?
There we go. Barbara, there's a person down in Santa Barbara, Fabi Gonzalez, that does wonderful work around ethnic studies. David and David and Ana Rosa both know her. So, yeah, my question, Dr. Christine, I appreciate your time, is kind of around pedagogy, and I'm curious. I understand the pedagogy from like a child standpoint and how we, talk about the dominant system within our current education of like, here, learn all these facts versus like learning to ask questions. And maybe if you can clarify what what the shift is in the pedagogy that we're trying to accomplish with ethnic studies, but also like, what does it look like to shift it in adult learning models? Like I haven't really seen effective models for, is it just having dialogue in education? That doesn't feel effective enough. So what shifts do we need to make?
Okay, here's a for instance. I'll give you an example of an ethnic studies high school teacher because the same thing would apply with working with older people as well as with younger people. But this was a really good high school teacher who is now a university faculty member at Cal State LA. So he would start his classes asking the students to talk about, he was in Anaheim, what were the issues in their lives and their communities that they saw as needing to be addressed in some way. And they would spend some time, and he's from the community, so he had a good idea of what the issues were, but he wanted to get from the students and get the students start to think about and name issues that were central to their lives. And then after spending a little bit of time doing that and kind of getting their experience, their concerns out there, then he would spend some time teaching students historically where those issues came from, politically, how they came to be where they are, what they are, what the broader roots are, how those issues are manifest in other places, both in California, as well as nationally, as well as globally. So then there was a lot of historical and political content knowledge, but it was kind of scaffolded around the issues that the students had named. Then he would have the students, he would teach them how to collect data, like social science data, through interviewing and through surveys, questionnaires, finding data that's readily available that they can analyze. And the students would do some community-based research in small groups around the issue that their group had named. And like one group, I remember, he would take his students to conferences. So I've heard from the students what they were doing. And one group that I hadn't really thought about this as an issue until the students brought it up and named it, and I was listening to them, was Airbnb, because here they are next to Disneyland, and in their communities, there are a lot of Airbnbs. And so when they started talking about the impact that that had on their lives and their families' lives, and I was like, wow. But the students anyway would then collect data on the issue. And then they would have this larger framing that he had taught them to use to analyze the issues. And then they would work in their groups to try to come up with solutions to the issue and do presentations either at conferences or to their school or to the city council, if the city council was interested in listening to them, which occasionally they were, so that they would be able to then take it out to larger audiences. So that's an example of shifting the pedagogy so that there's a kind of a co-construction between what the teacher's knowledge, and this is a very knowledgeable teacher, so he wasn't leaving knowledge at the door, but then interacting with the students and having the knowledge in a way that was connecting with student active inquiry. Does that kind of make sense?
Great.
Yeah, thank you. That's very clear.
Margie?
Oh, I didn't mean to raise my hand. I actually meant to give a thumbs up on that. But I did want to mention a couple of things. I don't know if any of you guys have seen that documentary Bad Faith that is streaming now, but it opened my eyes a lot to, some of the things that you brought up, Dr. Sleeter, since like around, what the desegregation movement that was happening nationally, that a lot of organizations came out of that because there are a lot of Christian nationalists who were opposed to desegregating their churches. And so there's some organizations that rose up to actually try to attack this. So that's when they started to shift the focus to abortion, so that, Christians would get up in arms over that rather than desegregation. So anyway, I just wanted to make a pitch for that there actually has been an active movement working against multicultural democracy in order to bring about Christian principles. And one of their goals was to take over the Republican Party, which has come about. So, and this has been going on for 40 years. So I just was shocked at this. So I just wanted to make a pitch for that. But I see Robina actually has her hand up too.
And what was the name of the movie again?
It's a documentary called Bad Faith. Pete Enns actually posted it on his Facebook. That's where I was like, oh, and so Bob and I watched it last night, and or the night before, and I was just totally blown away. I had no idea this is Bad Faith. Yeah.
Where can it be found?
Let me see. It's actually
Amazon.
Yeah, Amazon, YouTube, Tubi, Google Play, Apple TV. But I would definitely watch it because and then there were some speakers from the Ana Rosa, what's the name of the organization? I've lost it. It's the Poor People's Campaign. They're actually in there as well, addressing what they're doing to combat this. So I just felt like, oh, this is very appropriate for our church, because we want to help combat this ignorance as well.
Hi, Christine. I'm sorry I had to miss most of what you had to say. It is good to see you, and I didn't want to let you go without saying hello and welcome to this community. I so appreciate your being here.
Oh, thank you. It is just lovely to see you.
This has been such a great discussion, and I can tell that people are very interested. Thank you for everything that you provided, Christine. Just one last question that I wanted to see if we can tie in, people of color being real people, human beings, is part of the discussion here, but also climate change deniers. I have seen in some communities, they're trying to pair getting ethnic studies with environmental studies into curriculums. Just wondering if you know anything about that. And then also the last thing is, yes, it's important for us to know all these things, but also when are we going to get more people of color back into universities? So is there any movement to bring back affirmative action?
Oh boy, that's a lot of questions. Okay, one, getting climate science into curriculum, I think, is really important. And although it can be connected with studies, environmental racism is certainly a big issue that students do need to know about. I also would like to get both climate and ethnic studies into the curriculum, but not in competition with each other, because then one can lose out. I think they're both really important. An effort to get, well, let me talk then about the efforts to diversify the teaching force, which is a little bit different than your question about opening up affirmative action. But there is work and has been work around diversifying the teacher workforce and developing pathways that get students of color into teachers of color into teaching. And there's actually a lot of models around the US and people who are talking to each other and sharing ideas about how to build a more diverse teacher workforce. And I think that's critically important. As far as opening up affirmative action in higher ed, I don't, right now, I don't see a climate where that's going to happen, because there's so much from the right of thinking that affirmative action is racial preferences that are unfair, rather than what it is, which is holding the doors open and making sure that the doors stay open. That's what affirmative action essentially does. But there's so much flack on the right that I don't necessarily see affirmative action into higher ed coming back in the near future. But for the other things that you asked about, I do see work being done.
I noticed that I want to address that as a high school counselor. College admissions counselors are really encouraging students to answer questions, talking about their culture so that they're not using race per se, but they're looking to still build a diverse student population based on that. So my experience with this year's seniors, so many of our, especially UCs and CSUs are focusing on first gen students a lot more. They're getting a lot of great financial aid packages. It's my middle class students who are having a harder time getting in. But I also want to say UC starting next year have now adopted the ethnic studies graduation degree requirement as well as CSUs. So and also as well as their communications requirements. So I just feel like in California we're moving in the right direction.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, last one. Okay, Barbara's hand is up.
Sorry, that was accident.
Okay. Thank you, Ana Rosa and Margie, for opening up the conversation. Thank you, everybody. And can we all take a moment and say thank you to Christine? I mean, wow. Wow. Yeah.
I want to say this has been delightful.
Well, I agree. You make me think of, I grew up in a place called La Colonia in Oxnard, which is a barrio, and going to high school, a number of my friends, black and brown, especially males, dropped out and went to work, as at a gas station or something like that. And those days, people often looked down. When someone said someone was a dropout, that was disparaging, right? But it took me, as Ana Rosa was talking about how you find out more when you go to talk, when you're in higher education. And instead of looking at them disparagingly, I began to have this high degree of respect that they recognized something that I didn't, that we were being, propagandized in school, and they had no appetite for it. I was fighting through it and trying to, and I was being assimilated into this white-centered system, and so it took time, but I began to really respect their judgment, even though it may have cost them in some ways because they don't have degrees. They held on to their selves, their essential selves, and their dignity. So, I salute dropouts. Really. Anyway, we're gonna close out, and Bob's going to lead us in communion today.
Okay, so everybody, if you have your elements, grab those. I just want to say, Dr. Sleeter, thank you so much for such a rich and hopeful presentation. It's inspiring to see somebody who has such comprehensive understanding of something that seems so mysterious and problematic to us sometimes. So thank you very much for who you are and for what you're doing. So let me pray, and then I'll read the words from 1 Corinthians, and at any point, feel free to take the bread and the cup. So Lord, we thank you so much for this presentation today. Thank you for the power that you've given us. Thank you for the experience that you've given us. Thank you for the education that you've given us. Thank you for the place that you've given us. Thank you for who we are individually, that you have created us and you have helped our life circumstances shape us. Please help us also to go forward in our life, to take those things that you have given us and the things that we are, whatever they might be, to make a change in the world, to make it a better place for everyone in our own world as well as the larger world. Thank you. Thank you, Lord. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. Whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Amen.